Hello viewers. Here at Tafrishaala, we take you through the various facts and stories about the most curious subjects. In this episode, we shall explain the struggle story between the two largest countries of Asia, India and China. So, did this India-China tussle start during the pandemic? Or did it start because the Chinese products do not last long? Well, the India-China bitter relationship, surprisingly, dates to the ancient Indian era. And the core reason has always remained the territorial border that both nations share. Let us first look at the background of this saga. India shares its borders with China at two places, that is, the Eastern Front, along Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh, till Myanmar, and the Western Front, along Jammu and Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh, and Uttarakhand. Surprisingly, in this whole saga, only the great Indian Emperor Kanishka has successfully managed to invade parts of China during in ancient Indian era. After that, throughout the medieval times, and the modern age, there were many successful fights by the Mughals, the Degra dynasty and the British, but none could extend their empire to China. Now let us discuss the role of the British in the border issue. There happened many unsuccessful discussions on border delimitation issue with China. Then in year 1865, a British bureaucrat, William H. Johnson, decided the border line, which was called the Johnson Line. As per this line, a place called 𝐏𝐸𝐴 was shown in Jammu and Kashmir. As you can see in the Jammu and Kashmir map, which was earlier in Xinjiang province of China. As this place was autonomous, and not in the direct control of China, the British managed to take control over it. However, soon after in 1878, China regained the control of Xinjiang province. And consequently, the border tensions over 𝐏𝐸𝐴 started between China and the British India. Meanwhile, the British also wanted to resolve the border conflict with China the soonest, as they feared attacks by Russia. So, a British military officer, Sir John Ardner, proposed another border line, parallel to Johnson Line, along the Kunlun Mountains and north of Yarkand River. In the 19th century, Macartney-MacDonald Line was implemented, as per which a large part of 𝐏𝐸𝐴 belonged to China. In the second decade of 20th century, China suffered internal rebellions, and World War I had also begun. Due to this, China's condition weakened, as there was internal political unrest. Taking advantage of China's situation, the British started reconsidering the earlier Johnson Line, as per which the whole of 𝐏𝐸𝐴 was shown in India's map. China also did not retaliate to this. However, the British did not bother to demark this officially. This situation prevailed till India's independence, in 1947. This was the Chronicle about the Western Front. Now, let us see what happened in the Eastern Front of India-China border. That is, from Sikkim to Arunachal Pradesh. In 1826, the British conquered Assam, and later Myanmar as well. Meanwhile, they had built huge tea estates in Assam and Darjeeling. So, to protect the tea estates from any anticipated attack from China, they wanted to construct a border. Thus, in 1912, in a conclave in Shimla, where the British India, China, and Tibet participated, a border line by the name of McMahon Line was proposed. As per McMahon Line, the border stretched from Sikkim, via Arunachal Pradesh, till Myanmar. While China did not show any disagreement to McMahon Line during the conclave in Shimla, but later, they refused to abide by it. Nevertheless, McMahon Line was implemented, based on agreement from British India and Tibet. Also in 1914, Tibet announced its independence from China, and due to the prevailing internal unrest, China could not react. This was all about the western and eastern fronts of India-China border until India's independence. During the late 1940s, before India's independence, some changes in positive direction were seen in the India-China relations. In those times, China was governed by Kuomintang Party and its leader was Chiang Kai-shek. He once insisted the US to support India in its freedom struggle against the British. Hence, the Indian prominent leaders reciprocated this healthy gesture from China. Soon after, in 1949, the Chinese rule overturned, with an internal civil war, and the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, took over the rule. Chiang Kai-shek had to flee to Taiwan. While the US and other Western nations initially condemned recognition of this new regime in China, but India was one of the countries to recognize them and maintain a continuity. In year 1950, China conquered Tibet. There were two different reactions to this in India. While Jawaharlal Nehru, the then Prime Minister of India, considered it an internal issue of China, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, the Deputy Prime Minister, believed that India must support Tibet and condemn false intentions of China. Let us assess the reasons why Nehru believed in China and why China had affinity towards India. There existed direct or indirect suppression by the British on both countries. Both nations shared traditional, financial, religious, and cultural relations. They believed that united they can stand against the global superpowers. The USA-Pakistan association was a common cause of concern. China saw a similarity of notions in Nehru, his socialist image, in US non-alignment movement, and the fact that Nehru had acknowledged Tibet as a part of China. In 1954, Nehru also insisted China to respect the sovereignty of Tibet, and later signed the Panchsheel Agreement for peaceful coexistence. Consequently, there was an amicable relationship between India and China for some time. In 1956, the Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai visited India. The Indians welcomed him grandly, with slogans of Hindi Chinni Bye Bye, that means, India-China Brotherhood. However, peace did not last long. In 1957, there were severe protests in Tibet against Chinese oppression. And to suppress these protests, China secretly built a road from Ksai-Chin to Tibet, and showed it in the Chinese map. This was the start of the real conflict between India and China. Nehru and Zhou Enlai had several debates on this subject. When this information began spreading, it created an uproar in the country, and the opposition leaders and the public started pressurizing Nehru for an explanation. In 1959, Nehru gave a detailed report on this issue in the parliament. Meanwhile, Tibet's religious guru, Dalai Lama, visited India, seeking support against China. Many Indian leaders, like J. Prakash Narayan, Ram Manohar Lohia, and the Indian masses, voiced for his cause. In view of this, Nehru had to adopt an aggressive action, and thus, India deployed patrolling party at the eastern and western borders. Thereafter, there were several clashes between the Indian and Chinese patrol parties. The most dangerous clash occurred on 20th of October 1959, at Kongka Pass, where the Indian patrol party was attacked by the Chinese patrol party, and 9 Indian CRPF soldiers were martyred. In memory of this day, National Police Memorial Day is celebrated every year in India. This incident put further pressure on the Indian government by leaders like Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Consequently, Nehru took further measures, like constructing military posts, and deploying Indian army at the frontiers and in all no man's lands. On the other hand, Zhou presented a proposal to recede armies of both countries by 20 kilometers to avoid border clashes. This proposal was refused by the Nehru government, as compromise was not a solution. As a final attempt, in 1960, Zhou Enlai visited India again. But this time discreetly, as the Indian public were enraged and were sloganeering Hindi China bye bye, which means, India China bye bye. While Zhou Enlai stayed in India for 7 days and had lengthy discussions with Nehru and his cabinet ministers, like the Home Minister Govind Vallabh Pant, Finance Minister Morarji Desai, and the Indian Vice President, S. Radhakrishnan. But the result of the meetings was unproductive. Zhou Enlai had to return to China. Soon after, China began their false propaganda about India, claiming India has deviated from their original agenda, that India is moving towards capitalism, bourgeoisie dominion is affecting India, and so on. Amid this fuss, China secretly began preparing for a war. Nehru and India, however, remained in a dilemma, whether to start a war, or compromise. Though the ruling party, as well as the opposition parties, were all united, and believed in not compromising with China. The other option for India was to join hands with the Western nations, to strengthen India's military power for the war, for which neither Nehru nor the defense minister, Krishna Menon, were willing. Then came the eventful year, 1962. In July 1962, there was a clash between India and China at the famous Galwan Valley, followed by a clash in Thangla Pass, in Arunachal Pradesh. This was followed by attacks on both the eastern and the western fronts, on 19th or 20th of October 1962. China's attack was quite intense, and India was not prepared for this. On 24th of October 1962, China stopped the attack unilaterally, and Zhou Enlai proposed a truce to step back 20 kilometers each from the borders. However, Nehru again denied the proposal, and sought assistance from the Western nations. While the US and Britain agreed to dispatch arms and ammunition, France and Canada also extended cooperation with India. In view of these alliances, on 15th of November 1962, China again attacked India, conquered Arunachal Pradesh, and entered the plains of Assam. Then, China again declared a truce. The Chinese army moved towards Occad in the western front, and towards north of McMahon Line, in the eastern front. Now let us decipher the fact as to why did China choose this period for the war. First reason is that India was seeking assistance from the Western countries. During this period, the two superpowers, the US and Russia, were busy clashing with each other in the Cold War in Cuba. Secondly, the economic condition of China was deteriorating due to the aggressive policies of Mao Zedong and the Chinese ruling party, causing national discontent. To avoid a nationwide uproar, China misrepresented the war with India as their nationalism. Also, China feared that Russia might also assist India, as the Russian President Nikita Khrushchev, during one of his visits to China, insisted Mao Zedong to settle the border issues with India. Another reason is that China believed that the protests happening in Tibet against them is being controlled from India, as India had been supporting Tibet and Dalai Lama. Now, let us see what made China call for a ceasefire and propose the truce. As India was getting assistance from the Western countries, China feared this might contort the balance of the war. As China was not a superpower at that time, and the military and economic strength of both nations was similar. However, China stopped the attack in November 1962 due to the geographical and strategic reasons. The winter season had started, and the snowfall and snow-laden paths obstructed their warfare logistics movement. Also, by this time, China had already captured the regions of India, having strategical importance to them. Now, let us assess, how did China win the war? Despite the fact that both the countries had similar military and economic strength at that time. While India was in a dilemma whether to compromise or set up for a war, China was preparing for the war since almost 2 years. They were just waiting for the right time to strike. Second reason. China's army was almost 5 times in number as compared to that of India. They were well trained and used the most advanced military weaponry imported from Russia. Thirdly, the Chinese army had previous experience of fighting on the mountain terrains. They had been fighting with the rebels of Tibet on the mountains, whereas the Indian army did not have any previous experience of warfare on the mountains. Fourth reason. The Chinese army had a geographical advantage, as the mountains on their side was less steep. So, they could transport their warfare logistics easily. Whereas, the mountains on the Indian front were grueling and hard to climb. Also, the Chinese military posts were at high altitude, from where they could easily fire at the Indian posts. Finally, the most unfortunate reason for India's defeat was the lack of supervision. Unlike before, there was lack of political unity in India. Nehru was in his final stages of governance. The defense minister, Krishna Menon, was not in good terms with the chiefs of the army. And, most of all, the commander of the Western Indian Army, General Brij-Mohan Kaul, was unavailable to lead the Indian Army, as he was admitted in hospital due to illness. These were the reasons that led to the victory of China in the Sino-Indian War of 1962. After the War of 1962, clashes kept occurring between India and China. In 1963, China and Pakistan made an agreement. As per this agreement, Pakistan handed over to China an area of 5,180 square kilometers in a place called Gilgit-Baltistan. India opposed this agreement, as this region came under the Indian territory. Consequently, clashes started. And in 1965, there was a major clash in Nathula, Sikkim. Although Sikkim was not in India at that time, but India was responsible for the security of Sikkim. During construction of boundary by Indians within the McMahon Line, the Chinese troops attacked the Indian corps and the engineers. The Indian army, in retaliation, attacked the Chinese army strongly with cannons and defeated them. In this encounter, almost 80 Indian soldiers and 450 Chinese soldiers were killed. This was followed by clashes in Shola in Sikkim, and, in 1975, in Tulungla in Arunachal Pradesh. However, this was the last time we saw a casualty at the India-China border, till the recent Galwan Valley incident on 15th of June 2020. What is it that changed the scenario between India and China and brought in peace from 1975 to 2020 for almost 45 years? After the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, Deng Xiaoping, known as the father of the modern Chinese economy, opened the private sector for China. In the 1980s, China and India started developing economic relations with the rest of the world. Due to the revolutionary economic policy of China, they started to become an economic superpower by 1993. They started investing on basic protection infrastructure at the line of actual control, the LAC. They built huge highways, bridges, roads, for their army to commute. In this period, in years 1993, 1996 and 2013, India and China signed many agreements to restore peace at the borders, although the border conflict never settled. In one of the agreements, it was agreed by both the countries that no guns or arms were allowed within 2 kilometers from the LAC. The relations started improving because of these treaties. China also started becoming the major trade partner of India because of the improving relations. During the governance of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, the Indian economy also strengthened as trade liberalization and privatization started in India. India also started building basic protection infrastructure at the borders. And a road by the name of DSTBO Road, Octad Road, was a part of the plan. The length of this road is 255 kilometers, and was built to connect the airbase and the military post of Daulat Bay Goldi, a place of strategic importance to India. The construction of the road was started by the Manmohan Singh government and completed by the Narendra Modi government. Meanwhile, stone pelting, scuffles, and minor skirmishes kept happening between the Indian and Chinese armies. This was the Chronicle until the recent incidents of year 2020. Now, let us see what happened in the present times. In April 2020, the Chinese army started camping at the LAC, brought many military vehicles, and started tormenting the people engaged in the DSTBO road construction. These gatherings occurred at several places in the eastern and the western frontiers. In May 2020, there were clashes in Pangong Lake and Nakula Pass. The major clash occurred in Galwan Valley on the 15th of June 2020. The major reason for the Chinese intrusion and clashes were the construction of feeder roads connecting the DSTBO road with the LAC. One of these roads, passing through Galwan Valley, gave an easy access and transit to the Indian Army to reach the LAC. On the Chinese front, the Chinese Army had a strategic advantage, where they could reach the borders within 30 minutes, using their road connectivity. Whereas, for the Indian Army, earlier, it took almost 2 to 3 hours to reach the LAC. This feeder road in concern was time-saving for the Indian Army. And so, China was losing its strategic advantage. So, China could not withstand this. Before the incident of 15th of June 2020, the Chinese army had put 2 tents and camped near the bridge at the Galwan Valley. It was decided later that both the Indian and the Chinese army would back off by 2 kilometers. However, on the evening of 15th of June 2020, the Indian commander, while patrolling, found out that one of the Chinese tents remained there, with some soldiers inside. This caused a heated argument, followed by scuffles and brawl between the two armies. Later, a large number of Chinese army arrived, with barbed-wired rods and sticks, and attacked the Indian army ruthlessly. There was a serious collision by both sides. As a result, there were casualties and injuries to the soldiers at both sides. The Indian soldiers fought bravely, and many were martyred. After this incident, from the satellite pictures, it can still be seen that there are Chinese military vehicles and camping near the LAC. It can be stated that this is no less than a long-term arrangement by China. The Pangong Lake is huge and divided into 8 fingers. The mountainous spikes running down towards the lake are called fingers. India claims that the LAC is at finger 8, and China claims it to be at finger 4. Usually, Indian army would patrol till finger 8, and the Chinese army would patrol till finger 4. However, recently, the Chinese army have set up a camping at finger 4, and are not allowing the Indian army to enter further into fingers 5 to 8. During the Kargil War, when the Indian army were moved out, the Chinese took advantage of the situation, and built a road from finger 8 to finger 5, along the banks of the Pangong Lake. The mountain terrains from finger 4 to finger 1 are tough and toiling, and so, constructing roads there was not possible. Taking advantage of this, the Chinese army used the road between fingers 8 and 5, and have formed a concentration at finger 4. Why has China become so aggressive in the present times? In view of the events, it can be said that China has been preparing for this since long. Also, China seems to have taken advantage of the COVID-19 situation, as well as the normal Indian military drills have not taken place this summer due to the pandemic situation. China is also facing an economic setback and a nationwide discontent due to the prevailing pandemic situation. This looks like their situation of 1962. So, the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, is also trying to cover up the nationwide displeasure by diverting the notion to nationalism. China is not only straining with India, but also with regions of South China Sea, Vietnam, Philippines, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, and even Australia. China also seems to be combating COVID-19 much faster than the other countries. Also, they do not fear a backlash from the US due to the impact of COVID-19 on the US economy. Furthermore, China also has misconceived India's action of changing Ladakh to a union territory as an act impacting the frontiers, which was not the actual case. Due to the above reasons, China has taken an aggressive policy during the recent times. Now let us evaluate what India must do in this situation. India must improve its economic and military strength. At the same time, they should maintain the diplomatic relations with China. India should also focus on building the basic protection infrastructure at the borders, and should arrange proper military requirements, like protection gears, advanced weaponry, and ammunition. They should enhance large-scale manufacturing. India should try to capitalize on the weak points of China, like Taiwan, South China Sea, Hong Kong, and Tibet. And also, capitalize on the global disdainful outlook towards China, owing to the COVID-19 outspread. They should build relations with nations like Japan, Australia, South Korea, and the US to stand against China. India should find alternatives to reduce its dependency on imports from China and steady the trade imbalance. However, boycotting Chinese imports completely is not feasible, as a large part of raw materials, technology, spare parts, API for pharmaceuticals, machinery comes from China. China also has huge investments, majorly in Indian startups, like PayPal, Zomato, Ola, and so on. India should increase production and manufacturing to counter this issue for the long run. Finally, let us have a look at the Narendra Modi government's efforts in improving India-China relations over the recent period. India-China relations gained a huge momentum during the governance of Narendra Modi. As compared to the previous Prime Ministers of India, Mr. Modi has visited China the most. Even Xi Jinping has visited India twice during his tenure. Narendra Modi has been instrumental to improve trade ties with China. However, the big question is, whether China, like Jawaharlal Nehru, has deceived Narendra Modi as well? Perhaps yes, and he himself is aware of this deceit by China. However, unlike the situation of Mr. Nehru in 1960s, the contemporary Indian public supports and believes in Mr. Modi. There is no opposition of thoughts as well from his cabinet of ministers. Despite the displeasure among the masses against China, there exists no discontent for the Indian government and Mr. Modi. Hence, unlike Mr. Nehru, Mr. Modi is not facing any pressure at all, which makes him think positively. However, one thing is assured: that Indians can now hardly trust China for the generations to come. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed this episode. We will meet again with another big story.